now my buddy, my friend, a party animal, and an influencer globally, Don Tapscott. Come on down, Don. Love this guy. I love all his books. I'm a regular reviewer, shamelessly in love with every book you've written. I gave you one of your earliest columns. Because I'm a wise woman. Mutual admiration here. This is the most important revolution of tech going on right now. He will explain it to you. I find it difficult to understand, but Don is the guy. He's the guru. Take it away.
Thank you. Go ahead. In 1978, I was hired by Bell Northern Research as part of a team, I know I'm dating myself, to figure out how computers connected to a vast network of networks might change the nature of managerial work and the design of organizations. And we came to the conclusion that everybody was going to use a computer, because back then only programmers did, and that they would become a communications tool. I wrote a book arguing that in 1981. It was a study in bad timing. My mother bought most of the copies of that book. But for the last, that's 4 decades now, we've had the internet, and it's been the internet of information, right? Well, I'm about to try and convince you that we're moving into a next period of a few decades where we will also have an internet of value. And the internet of information was based on Silicon Valley, right? What do they got? FANG, Facebook, Apple, Netscape, and Google. They have all the money in the world, venture capital and all kinds of investment. They have entrepreneurship galore, and they have talent. I don't think the second era of the internet will be based in Silicon Valley. And I think it could be based in Canada. And what I'd like to do is explain why. So, Diane gave a lucid and compelling presentation at the beginning about all these amazing new technologies, part of the fourth industrial revolution, as Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum calls it. First was steam, and we mechanized shovels and hose. The second was electricity, created the industrial production line. The third was the computer, mainframes, minis, PCs, the web, the social web, mobility, big data, the cloud. And we're now entering into a fourth where technology is infused into everything, into the physical world that we're animating, into our bodies, into every business, every process. Now, there's another technology that's kind of critical to this picture. And it's different, and it may be the most important. And you're going to be surprised to hear me say it's the underlying technology of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. And this technology represents nothing less than the second era of the internet. Now, let me explain that. When I send you some information, PDF, PowerPoint, Word document, email, I'm actually not sending you that information. I'm sending you a copy. Even with a website, I keep the original. And this has been great. We've all had a printing press at our fingertips, and that's democratized information, right? But when it comes to the things that really matter to the economy and to prosperity, things like money and stocks and bonds and swaps and contracts and deeds and loyalty points and things like art and music, even votes, energy, our identities. Sending a copy is a terrible idea. If I send you $100, it's really important that I don't still have the money and that I can't send it to you and to you. Now, this has been called the double spend problem by cryptographers for a long time. We haven't had a peer-to-peer medium for the exchange of value. So the only way that we can handle this is through large intermediaries, banks, governments, credit card companies, now big social media companies, perform all the business and transaction logic of every type of commerce, and they enable us to trust each other. And overall, they do a pretty good job, but increasingly they need help. They're all centralized, which means they can be hacked. And everybody from JP Morgan to Home Depot to the CIA has found that out the hard way. They slow things down. It takes a second for an email to go around the world, but it can take days, even weeks, for money and computers to move down the street in Toronto. They take a big piece of the action. Western Union may charge 10, even 20% to send money from one country to another. You ever heard of fees for cross-border email? Well, we have big fees when money moves around. And they exclude a couple of billion people from the global economy. You don't have enough money to have a bank account or don't have an identity. And the biggest issue here is they capture our data. All of us create this data. It's the biggest asset, maybe ever, a new asset class, but they keep it. And the bottom line is the largesse of the digital age has been distributed asymmetrically. And we have this crazy situation today where wealth is growing and prosperity for most people is declining. What if there were not just an internet of information, what if there were an internet of value? Some kind of vast, oh, by the way, this is, before I go there, the intermediaries have one other problem. Where were you in September in 2008 when Lehman Brothers fell? Well, the day after that occurred, I was on the stage at Sibos in front of 8,000 bankers in Vienna. It was kind of like deer in the headlights, to use a Canadian expression. But the core modus operandi of some of these intermediaries, Wall Street, almost brought down the global capitalist system. We were days, some people say, hours away from the ATMs running out of money. Now, the Canadian banks did a lot better job. We'll get to that in a sec. So what if there were not just an internet of information, an internet of value, where anything of value from money to stocks to votes to music could be stored, managed, transacted, secured in a confidential way with appropriate transparency? What if there were a native digital medium for value? Well, 2008, perhaps propitiously, an anonymous person or persons named Satoshi Nakamoto wrote a paper outlining a protocol for a new kind of digital cash that he or she or they called Bitcoin. And this has set off a prairie fire. And honestly, it took people like me a while to figure out what was really going on here. Because Bitcoin is an asset. It goes up and down in value. It's gone up and down, like 30% in the last week. But overall, it's up big time. You know, if you invested in Bitcoin when it first came out, the amount of money to buy a pizza would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But Bitcoin is more broadly, it's a cryptocurrency. It's not controlled by a nation state. And that has some interesting use cases. Like a housekeeper in Toronto can send her remittances to her mom back in, say, the Philippines and not get charged 10%, get charged 1%. It doesn't take 4 to 7 days. It happens overnight. In minutes. So that's kind of interesting. But the real pony here is the underlying technology called the blockchain. For the first time in human history, people can now trust each other and transact without an intermediary. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to go away, but they are challenged. Now, at this point, everyone's wondering, well, how the heck can this possibly work? Mark Twain, you know, I'm sorry I wrote such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one. It's taken me 4 years to be able to say this in 2 minutes. So here we go. Put on your stopwatch. When I send you that $100, it's broadcast out to a global network of millions of computers, all using the highest level of cryptography. And then all around the world is a group of people called miners, not young people, like gold miners. And they have massive computing power, estimated to be 10 to 50 times the power of Google in the world. And these miners do a lot of work to find out the truth and to validate what's actually occurred. And every 10 minutes, kind of like the heartbeat of a network, a block gets created. And that block has all the transactions from the last 10 minutes. The fact that I sent $100. The fact that somebody got married, it could be, or somebody bought a house, or a stock was traded, or some light bought power from a distributed microgrid. Any transaction. And then the miners go to work, and they use all this computing power to validate and find out the truth. And the first miner gets paid some of the cryptocurrency from that blockchain. And then, this is the important part, that block is linked to the previous block and the previous block, kind of like a digital wax seal. And the block is only valid if it references all the rest of the blocks to create a chain of blocks. And if I wanted to hack that $100 and send it to you and to you and to you, the same money, I'd have to hack that block plus the previous block, everything in the entire chain, the whole history of commerce, not just on one computer, but across millions of computers simultaneously, all using the highest level of cryptography. That's going to be tough to do. I think of it as that this thing is something that's very processed, like a chicken McNugget. And you'd have to turn it back into a chicken, to hack it. Now, someone will be able to do that someday, but not right now. So my son Alex, been this joyous collaboration, began working on this a few years ago, and we wrote Blockchain Revolution. It's been still on the bestsellers list a year later in the Globe and Mail last Saturday. And it's a bestseller now in 5 Asian countries in different languages. And it got to number 2, never number 1 of all books. Damn you, Harry Potter. The best way to get this book, by the way, is in massive volume. Anyway, moving along here. To get to the point, where is this going to be based this time? I don't know about Silicon Valley. Leaders of old paradigms have great difficulty embracing the new, right? And they're locked into old models, big data, the cloud, and so on. And many Silicon Valley investors are just looking at Bitcoin as an asset. And, oh boy, if this thing goes any higher, we're making more money than we ever did. We were hired by the federal government, Alex and I, to investigate the possibility that this could be based in Canada. Now, there's a fine line between vision and hallucination that you need to watch. But we came to the conclusion that this is not only conceivable, it's actually quite likely if we do some things. Here's why. First of all, Ethereum is a blockchain created by a 19-year-old Toronto high school student that now is getting close to passing Bitcoin, the mother of everything, in its value. And the biggest Ethereum community in the world is based here in Toronto. Who's heard of Ethereum? Hands. Okay, what's that? 25% of the audience? Ethereum is worth $32 billion. This is the most successful startup in Canada. In decades, nobody's heard of it. This is really under the radar. We got to wake up. Now, there are other blockchains. Here's one that did, it's called an initial coin offering. It's called Tendermint. And this did this in April, and they raised $13 million in 30 minutes. The financial industry is being transformed. Anyone recognize this? It's called a Rube Goldberg machine, a ridiculously complicated machine that does something really simple, like crack an egg or open a door. I look at the banking system, and I see that, pretty much. You tap your card at Starbucks, and a bit stream goes through 7 companies, each using ancient technology, each with a counterparty risk, and 3 days later, a settlement occurs. Well, if the banks moved to a blockchain platform, there would be no 3-day settlement, because the payment and the settlement is the same activity. It's just a change in the database. So Canada has 5 banks, big ones, that are all innovators in this space. Not 95. The banks in the US will never get together to reinvent the financial system, but the Canadian banks could. and we're working hard to make sure that they do. Canadian business needs to wake up and understand that this is not about fintech only. If you think about blockchain being like that, fintech is a smaller circle that's mainly inside the big circle. But this affects every industry in Canada. The governments can be transformed. We can move to a whole new model of government now. It's finally possible, and we can help solve the crisis of legitimacy of our democratic institutions, typified by the fact that young people are not voting around the world. Canada is an exception. And in the United States, the president says democracy is not a legitimate system. It's corrupt, and it's fixed, and so on. So imagine elected representatives coming to power with a smart contract on an e-voting system enabled by blockchains. Because there'll never be e-voting without a blockchain. Because you're not going to vote on a computer unless you have cryptographic proof that your vote was cast for the person for whom you voted, and it can't be moved to somebody else. Only this technology can do that. The banks all around the world, the central banks, are deeply involved in trying to figure this stuff out. And my co-author, Alex, is actually a Canadian representative on the global IMF task force to reinvent the global banking system. And imagine if the Canadian dollar became a crypto dollar. So when the banks, the central bank, issued some new money, and they wouldn't give it to the banks and hope the banks do something. They could helicopter drop it, and they could also see the impact instantly on the economy. Blockchains are going to enable a new period of entrepreneurship where little companies can have the capabilities of big companies. And Canada is doing really well in that area. And we have this thing now called initial coin offerings, where entrepreneurs don't need to go to the big banks to get funding. So Canadian entrepreneurs can do this. I mentioned Cosmos a month and a half ago, $13 million in 28 minutes. Gnosis, $13 million in 14 minutes. There's a trend here. The Brave browser, $35 million raised in 30 seconds. And just yesterday, Bancor raised $163 million in 2.5 hours. So this is challenging the banks for sure, but we can get all the money that we need now. And then the biggest entrepreneur or incubators in North America are in Toronto. The Digital Media Zone at Ryerson, Mars, and the Creative Destruction Lab at the University of Toronto is an extraordinary thing. And our Blockchain Research Institute just moved into 111. We're sitting there with hundreds of companies that are doing stuff. Now, I'm out of time, but this is a great story, that this entity that had no people, a company with no people, raised $163 million on a blockchain. It's not totally a happy story because there was a problem. They decided to give the money back. But Bob Dylan, there's something going on here and you don't know what it is. This is kind of huge. So there are a number of things that we need to do. Read the Blockchain Corridor Report. Go to the Google and it'll give it to you. And one of the things we need to do is we need our securities legislators to pass legislation to make this the most hospitable country in the world to be doing these ICOs and to be raising funds. And if we do that, wonderful things can happen. Now, I'd like to just end, if I could. If we could turn the volume on that down, that would be great. Way down, please. We've been studying organizations, and recently Alex and I have been studying nature to try and figure out what this trust protocol might look like. And bees come in swarms, fish come in schools, starlings over the moors of England come in something called a murmuration. It refers to the murmuring of the wings of the birds. And the birds are out over a 20-mile radius doing their starling thing. And at night they come together and they create one of the most spectacular things in all of nature. And the murmuration has a function. It warms up the birds for the cold night ahead. But one of the things it does is it protects the birds from predators. Look on the right of the screen here. You can see a hawk, 25 times the size of a starling, being chased away by the collective power of the little birds. Scientists that have studied this say they've never seen an accident. And there's leadership, but there's no one leader. And when the moment is right, this magic happens. Now, is this some kind of fanciful analogy, or might it actually be something we can learn from? This murmuration functions according to the principle of this trust protocol and this new blockchain platform. In blockchains, trust is not achieved by a big intermediary. It's achieved by cryptography, by collaboration, and by some clever code. The code is there in the murmuration. It's in their DNA. There are rules. Don't bump into anybody else. Don't get too far away. This is a huge collaboration. There's a sharing of all kinds of information. And the murmuration also functions on the concept of interdependence, as do blockchains. That all the birds act as if the interest of the individual bird is connected to the interests of the murmuration as a whole. And overall, it has a great integrity that gives the birds the courage to take on a fierce predator. They can do that. A little bird will go after something, a killer 25 times its size, because it knows that the other birds will have its back. And that's what trust is. Trust is the expectation that the other party will do the right thing, that they'll act with integrity. For humans, they'll be honest. They'll be considerate of your interests, and they'll abide by their commitments. In this new platform, trust is synthetic, and it's built into the platform. You can't cheat somebody. You can't do the wrong thing. So imagine if we connected ourselves on this planet with some kind of vast network of glass and air, where we had a distributed platform for achieving a whole new era of trust. What extraordinary things could we do? How could we solve this prosperity paradox? And could Canada lead in making this happen? Well, I'm of the view that the future is not something to be predicted. It's something to be achieved. And if we do this, then maybe this smaller, more distributed, and more trusting country that we can build will be a country that our children inherit, that will be a better one. And this age of distributed trust will be an age where the promise of the digital age is finally fulfilled. Let's do this. Thank you.
You're the best, sweetheart. That's wonderful. We're going to take a picture. Isn't he great? It's a treasure.
Yeah, you're a good man. Oh, wait. One little adjustment.
Do you have film in that thing?
Yeah, but I just ran out. Now we're better.
Okay.
We better be. Yeah, this is good. One more. Eyes
Okay.
open. And we're going to go take a picture of
Thank you.
Jacket so much. I've come out to get a picture taken with you as well.
Oh, yeah, the three of us.
And wasn't she great? Yeah. And we have books to tell you about.
Second floor, right?
Yes, the bookstore. These are books by the Tapscotts, and this is a book by Diane Francis.
Yay.
And I do have a question for both of you. It seems so fundamental, so possibly massive, and yet the creator is unknown. Isn't that an amazing thing? Is he unknown? Is it a she? Do you have any idea who invented the
Everyone has a
blockchain?
theory, but it actually doesn't matter, because unlike, say, Linux, that was created by Linus Torvald, he's hung around. He's the ultimate arbitrator. He's deeply involved. Whereas with Satoshi Nakamoto, he created this thing and then he let it go. And once Alex and I were being interviewed on TV, and this guy, Craig Wright, had said, "I'm Satoshi Nakamoto." So we were asked, is Craig Wright the man? And Alex and I looked at each other. It's great working with someone who shares your DNA. And we both said together, is, I think it's time. So we both said together, we are Satoshi Nakamoto. But we are in a sense, because this thing is created by a big community. We're part of that community, so we are all Satoshi.
But what a selfless individual, if it was the act of an individual,
Well,
because
not so much.
everyone is making money off the idea.
That's true. But he probably owns some Bitcoin himself.
So,
Like a lot.
and it's possible that the identity will never be revealed.
Quite possible. I think even likely.
Can you hide hundreds of billions of dollars?
Well, it's not hidden. It's all there for everyone to see.
But we don't know who owns it.
Well, no, we have an idea who owns it. There's a pretty good idea. And by the way, the dark side, law enforcement, when we started working on this, they were very worried about this, all kinds of anonymous transactions. And criminals always use new technology most effectively before anybody else. I mean, Al Capone in the automobile, and the flip phone on Breaking Bad, and so on. But now, the really smart law enforcement people think this is great, because even though the transaction is anonymous, they can have metadata, so they know if weird stuff is going on, and they're using it to catch the bad guys.
Splendid. Thank you, and thank you, Diane. Yes, put me in the middle. Right.